We do have, this is a monthly seminar program here at Venable. We really love to give these programs and talk about issues of importance to the nonprofit community. And November's program is on the 13th, and that topic is sweepstakes, raffles, and other contests, everything your nonprofit needs to know to stay out of trouble. And we will be getting out registration information soon, and stay tuned for December. We're working on a program for that as well. So today, after I finish with these brief introductions, we're going to get started with our panelists, and this is slightly different than a lot of our programs that we do here in that we're keeping the lawyers to a very minimum. And my role is at the end just to talk about, because there are legal and tax issues that are involved in a lot of what we're talking about, but we know a lot of the reason you're here is to hear from your peers and hear from your colleagues as to what's going on out there, what ideas might be out there. And we really invite an exchange as well, both here in person and those who are participating by phone, because we'd love to hear any ideas that you have and of course, entertain any questions you might have. We'll start with a sort of a bigger picture overview of trends with associations on dues and non-dues programs, and go into some case studies with our two panelists who are here from different associations. I'll close out with that discussion of some legal and tax issues, and then we'll get to Q&A. And hopefully we'll have a lot of time for that, and have an opportunity to get to really get questions answered, and also, like I said, understand from you what what may be working for you and what may not be. So very briefly, we've got some great panelists here who have tremendous background and experience. In the interest of time, I won't go over the full bio that's been provided to everybody as part of the advanced materials, but just trust me to know that these folks really have some great backgrounds and come to this program with good experience that will inform their discussion. To my immediate left is Shelley Sanner, and Shelley is the Senior Vice President of Consulting at McKinley Advisors. Many of you may know McKinley. McKinley is a very well-known name in the association community, does great work on a number of consulting areas, not least of which being helping associations identify programs that will be successful for them and their members. Shelley's been with McKinley for more than 10 years, almost 10 years, more than 10 years. American Council of Education prior to that, and has been active and involved in the American Society of Association Executives for many, many years, and how I got to know Shelley many, many years ago, doing programs for CAE training, I believe. So welcome, Shelley. To her left is Heidi Voorhees, and Heidi is the Chief Operating Officer of Vixa, the Audiovisual Integrated Experience Association. So as we were joking about the clicker, Heidi is the expert on how to use this and how to advance the slides, among other things. She has a tremendous background in associations and has worked for more than 20 plus years in the nonprofit and association community, including working for Smith Buckland, a very large association management firm that many of you may know. And Heidi also comes with a background from the for-profit world as well, and has actually done her time with some startups and sort of brings that perspective to her role as Chief Operating Officer at Vixa, and hopefully that will help give us some ideas on different approaches for non-dues revenue programs. And last but not least, all the way at the end here is Rob Henry, Vice President of Education at CASE, the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. Rob has been there for almost 13 years, started kind of in a Chief Diversity Officer position, and has sort of taken on more and more responsibilities and taken on better titles along the way. And Rob will be able to give us some of his background and experience on his association's efforts on the non-dues front. So with that, I think we will turn it over to Shelley.
Thank you. Am I coming through? Okay. Hi, welcome. Yeah, this is a really, as we'll see, a very timely, very important topic for a lot of associations. We've gathered some data at McKinley, and I'll share just a little bit of that today. The work that we do, I would say almost every project or challenge that comes McKinley's way, we solve with research. Not every single one, but most of them. So we're big fans of research. I think back to my days when I was a director of membership, and I used to wonder, how do I solve this? And now if I could go back in time, I know exactly how I would do it. Hindsight's 20/20. But as you can see, we really impact and we talk to a lot of members day in and day out. For the research that I'm going to share today, This actually reflects the perceptions of colleagues of yours. So these are association professionals. It's a study that we've been doing since 2010. We actually gathered data on 2009. So as you know, it was around the time that the economy was really tanking. And we wanted to understand what are some of the issues for associations. And we had a series of questions, and we've been able to ask them year over year so we can look longitudinally. What are people thinking? What are their priorities? And something to just note here, the really interesting trends. So at the bottom, you see that 2009 data reported in 2010. Those who said the conditions were worse than expected was very high. It peaked that year. And again, it was really a reflection of the economy. And then if you follow that, that generally pretty quickly diminished in the following year, and it's just diminished slowly over time, kind of held steady. But if we look over on the your left, 2018 was a really unique year for most associations where the conditions were really better than expected. And it looked more like those recovery years of 2011 and 2012. That is not the case for every sector. As probably many of you know, you can guess there are some that are more beleaguered than others. So these are the conditions that we know are happening. At the same time, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that we're here today, conditions were good, but if we look at the ability to serve members, recruit them and retain them, and the value of an association, whether it's a trade or an individual association, that's really started to flatten out. We need to watch this trend over time, but this is 5-year reported net annualized growth. So you can see that those who are saying that their membership is growing overall, 12% in 2008, and that's lower than it was from 2015 to 2017. So again, we have to watch this, but it looks like there was really steady growth and maybe a leveling out now, maybe even a decline over time. So that's a challenge for a lot of associations. This is really the smoking gun for what we're talking about today. We ask associations, what are your 3 highest priorities for the coming year? And what was unique about 2018 is that associations showed the highest percentage or the highest consensus around what those priorities were. So top is generating non-dues revenue, and percentages you can see there in blue and then the dark black or navy color. Below that, percentages were lower in the previous 2 years. It suddenly shot up. So about 1 in every 3 respondents was saying this is one of our top priorities, followed by developing new methods for member engagement, which I would say can actually kind of align with that. It's about participation, and whether you participate through a member benefit or you pay separately for it. It's really about how to create more of a transactional relationship, not just the theoretical, oh, I love my association and I'll come back. I'm a member of ASAE. ASAE helped me get the job I have today. I'm not going to drop membership, but that's not the case for everyone. A lot of people really scrutinize the value. And I thought it would be helpful to break it out. How many of you come from professional associations where you have the individual members? Okay, and I know we have a lot of people virtually. We can't see you, but I'm sure there's a scattering. How many trade association? Okay. And
slightly more trade, for the people on the phone, slightly more trade than professional society.
And how many hybrid association where you have kind of both? Yeah. Good. Those hybrids are doing really well, and actually the data shows it here too. So all of this data looks very different depending on whether you look at the sector, which might be finance, it might be construction, it might be scientific organizations. But here I broke it out just in terms of those types of associations. And some of the things that stand out is for professional associations, the retention rate has decreased at a dramatic level than it has for the other 2 types of associations. So professional associations really feeling the pinch on retention. And then trade associations are doing, fine overall. Hybrid associations doing really well when it comes to retention. So a lot of them reporting an increase in retention. And that data is validated by a lot of other studies I've looked at. We just generally know. It's usually an individual association introducing organizational membership rather than the reverse. Usually for a trade association, the impact isn't as significant. So that's just some of the trends for those associations. I like when we're talking about topics like this that are so important to throw something out that's kind of provocative. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, okay, well, what are some non-dues revenue ideas? Like, let's just hear what products are being developed and how we could maybe replicate that in our own associations. I would say it's really important to look inward. I think some of the best non-dues revenue products are really informed by what the members need, and in some cases really address a challenge. So if you take affinity programs like an insurance program, those are struggling for a lot of associations, but not everyone. So if you take, say, a massage therapist where salaries are relatively low and you might be working just as a solo practitioner, insurance is more important for that audience. So being able to develop something that really is uniquely relevant for your membership is important. The other thing I'll say is non-dues revenue is a great term. Everyone knows it, but it's not 100% accurate. And the reason it's not accurate, this is just a sample. This is not one association, although we do this exercise quite a bit, especially for trade associations. You could do it for a professional association too. What this shows is a hypothetical dues amount. So let's say you're a small company and your dues are $5,000. A lot of associations think in terms of their silos. So, okay, well, we're asking a member to pay $5,000. They receive that invoice. When you actually start looking at transactional data and participation, and then you put a value behind that, the spend from the company's perspective can look very different from that dues rate. So not every association is thinking that way, but every member is probably thinking that way. So we go from $5,000 dues to more than double that on the total spend, because let's just say they have great training programs so the employees within the organization can participate, and when you total that registration fee, or let's say they have an accreditation program and there's a fee attached to that. So when you think about non-dues revenue, your audience, the target audience, is probably going to be membership. It could be outside of the organization. It could be a secondary audience, but just be thinking about that when you're coming up with these ideas and thinking about markets. It's a really important piece of it. And I love this analogy. Anyone who flies, can really appreciate the nickel and diming that happens. And again, as you think about introducing new offerings, you don't want to appear to be nickel and diming your members. You want the Southwest model where more is included. There's still really strong value proposition, because I guarantee even the associations that are struggling still probably have members who are really very devoted to the organization and would retain their membership no matter what. So strong value proposition at the same time that you're looking to really diversify your revenue. Are we taking questions now?
Well, if there are any, we certainly have to take them. But
any questions? Yes, Kelly.
we got a microphone.
No, thank you, Shelley. That was very, very good. Question, are the people the same people you surveyed year over year, or is it different group?
It does change. The numbers are about the same, so we watch the total respondents pretty closely, and then we break it out into those different sectors, and we make sure we have the right number of individuals for those, but it can change year over year.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, over to Heidi.
Is it on now? Yeah, see? Yeah, I'm in the AV industry. So I want to give a little bit of just an example of our revenue model, and it's probably very different from a lot of you. We talk about non-dues revenue. I'm going to talk about what is dues revenue, because we have very, very little dues revenue. So I'll talk a little bit what our revenue model looks like. Perhaps that'll just spark some ideas of different ways to look at trying to diversify your revenue streams. So Vixa, we've been a Vixa for a little over a year. We used to be Infocom, for those of you who have heard of Infocom. We switched our name, we branded. McKinley actually helped us in the very start of that project with looking at how do we make sure that we are representing and talking the talk and being who we say we are. So Vixa is the Audiovisual and Integrated Experience Association. Audiovisual is what we do. Integrated experiences are what we create, and associations is who we are. That way, as an association, we support and grow the industry. So we work across the entire industry, and we make sure that everyone across that value chain is leveraging AV and technology that actually creates integrated experiences that at the end of the day creates better business outcomes. And we're doing a lot of education to vertical markets to try to talk about the strategic value of AV. We're not just, as we talked about, we are an industry association. So we are that hybrid model. So we are a trade association and a professional society combined, which creates lots and lots of interesting, fun times, I'll say. We were founded in 1939, so we are a mature organization. We have about 139 employees, and that is global. We have staff in Europe, in Latin America, and Asia Pacific. We actually, again, cross the entire value chain from manufacturers like Sony, Panasonic, Bose, and through down to distributors, to designers, to the content creators that create the stuff that go up on the giant AV screens, to the technicians that actually pull cable. So when you talk about diverse organizations and lots of stakeholders, you know what you're talking about. So I'll talk a little bit. We are just a regular general trade association and professional society kind of combined, and we have a lot of the same products and services that most associations do. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then where some of our revenue streams come from each of those areas, and then talk about our revenue model. So from a training perspective, we do several different types of training. We actually have staff instructors fully employed. They do regional training. Well, we'll say we're going to do a several-day course in Austin, Texas, and they'll go down and they'll do classes there. We also do contract training where we'll go to manufacturer distributors to their location and do training. We also license our training. So we do online courses, we do virtual classrooms, and we do live training. So we also license all of the content that we have, so we can license to a manufacturer or distributor who wants to do training on their own, but use our curriculum. We are also looking at leveraging our LMS system and, I guess, renting those out to companies that can't afford to have their own LMS system. So within our industry, instead of, if they have their own training and development group and they're doing a lot of that in-house, but they have to maintain and track their certifications of their staff, we're looking at letting them use our LMS system as sort of as their LMS system. So that also gives us opportunities to track what they're doing and looking at. But we're just starting to look at that. We've got a couple of different companies that are interested in that. We're trying to figure out what the model looks like. Certification. How many folks have certification programs? Awesome. So it's a really great opportunity for new revenue. We have 3 certifications. Certified technology specialist in design, and 1 in installation. All 3 of those are ANSI certified. So those of you that have to go through ANSI certification, you know how painful that is. But there are also other types of certifications. Everyone's laughing. Who knows the pain of that?
We have ANSI.
Oh, ANSI, awesome. We're like, it's
in
awesome.
A good way.
No, it is. It's a lot of work, but it's the right thing to do, right? Like it's worth it. It's a lot of work. So we also have some certifications or certificate programs that are not ANSI certified, that we have some micro-credentials and an AV technologist that is a much like the very entry-level group. Standards, I'm not going to talk too much about these. We actually are starting to give these away. So from a revenue model perspective, it's like zero. But it is also another, it is a member benefit that we provide and to support the industry.
Heidi, just while this pause, on the certification activities, how are those the certificates doing? Is that a big part of the revenue, or is it just sort of starting out?
We just launched them last year. Yeah. So yeah, we're still like working on those. And we're launching some new ones coming up. So we have had some traction on it.
Right.
And we feel like that's actually a really good opportunity for us to start training in microbites, right? Instead of a whole big program that people don't necessarily have time for a whole program or that. So they just have little microbites and get certified, and they might have a lot of education and experience in one area, but be missing one section. So cable pulling, right, is one. So they might not have that one, or they might just need that education in that one area to get a job.
Yeah, and are the employers looking at that favorably already, or is it?
Yeah.
Good.
And I just want to add that that's such a challenge, particularly for trade associations, where workforce retention and recruitment and development is usually very high on the challenges we see from company CEOs. So it's a great model to provide that training and really distinguish those who receive it.
So from a member service perspective, we do traditional things like most groups. Like we provide discounts on our products and services. We have a membership directory. We do mentoring programs. We have peer-to-peer groups that we're going to start launching. One of the things that Shelley was talking about is, which is kind of opposite for us, we just launched a new membership model in January. So instead of having an enterprise membership and an individual membership, we now have 3 in each category. To mix that up. And then we also changed our exhibit sales model too at the same time. That was really fun. But our professional society membership has actually gone up a lot more than we expected it to. And our enterprise level membership has actually gone down a little bit. I think a lot of that has to do with our pricing model. We went from $500 as our standard to the highest level, which is $4,750. So there's a big gap there. So it's a lot of education about what the benefits are in each of those groups. We've had some really interesting learnings. So if anyone is going through membership models and looking at that, I'm happy to talk offline on the pains of that, because there's a lot of things. And actually, we're looking at making some changes even for next year. Even though it's only been in 1 year, we've learned a lot. So I'm happy to talk about that. And our membership across the board has also been pretty flat. Like I said, our professional society is going up, but in general, our membership is flat. Our revenue is going up because we actually changed the revenue model on that. But yeah, we are at the same point flat. And for us, we're looking for growth. So we're starting to target some new markets that aren't the traditional folks that think of themselves in the AV industry. We also do market intelligence, market research reports. We have one that's pretty high level industry outlook and trends analysis. There are 5 parts to that and totals about $20,000 or so. We have some other reports that are macroeconomic trends analysis that we provide free to all members. And then we have some market outlook reports, and those are priced much lower for our members that are looking to go into different markets. And then our trade shows and conferences. From a conference perspective, we have an executive conference. We have a technology innovation design conference. And some of those are in conjunction with our trade shows. So I'll talk a little bit about our trade shows. This is mostly our revenue model. I'll show a few more slides later, but basically about 80 to 85% of our revenue comes from our trade shows. So when I talk about dues revenue, it's about 4% of our annual budget. So how we have launched these shows and the Infocom show brand, which is interesting. We did keep the Infocom brand for our trade shows, even though we rebranded the name of the association. When we say, do you belong to Infocom? They'd say, oh, I went to the show. But they didn't necessarily know there's an association attached. So we really wanted to try to break those up and be really clear. But the Infocom brand has really strong loyalty globally. So our Infocom show, we have a U.S. show, and that is wholly owned by Vixa. So we own it 100%. We have, when you see the Integrated Systems Europe and Russia, we formed a for-profit company. It's based in Munich, and it was with 2 other associations. Those we have now gone down, so now it's just 2 associations. We did buy out one of the associations. We have 2 associations that combine. The other one is in residential audiovisual, and we are commercial audiovisual. So we combine, we each own 50% of that for-profit company that puts on ISE, Integrated Systems Europe, and ISR, Integrated Systems Russia. I don't know if anyone's been to or heard of ISE in Europe. That is our largest show. It is about 80,000 attendees, and we are having to move out of Amsterdam because there's not enough space for us. So it's a really, really good problem to have. It's sad, though, because it's been a great location for us. So that is a for-profit company that we partnered with another association to combine or to form. Our Infocom Asia, we have Infocom China. We actually have 2 shows in China now. We just launched one this year for the first time. So we have 2 shows in China. We have India, and next year in May, we're launching Southeast Asia in Bangkok. This is a partnership that we formed with a for-profit show organizer in Asia. So instead of looking at other associations to partner with, we looked at show organizers that were already in the space. For those of you that work in Asia, know that you really have to have a partner that is in that space in order to be able to operate. So we have the 4 shows that we work with that group. TMI, Techno Multimedia. This is another for-profit company that we formed with a media partner in Latin America. And we have 3 shows that we do in conjunction with them: Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. So that was a media partner versus a show organizer. And then our Integrate show is in Australia, and that is a show we do with Diversified, and we just licensed the Infocom brand to that organizer. So we have several different models of how we worked with different organizations in order to get our brand distributed across the globe.
Heidi, are there any international that is strictly Vixa, or do you always have a partner internationally?
As of right now, we only have partners.
Yeah. Is there, of the models that you've been working with, is there one that seems most effective and efficient? Other associations, for-profit, working with a media company as opposed to a show organizer?
I would say the ones that we have a majority ownership in.
There you go. Okay. Right.
So we either have between a 50-50, we have a 60% down to a 40%, depending on the group that we're working with. Really, the key is to actually have a really good, strong partner that you can trust and give them guidance and counsel, and make sure that our brand is consistent across the globe, but know that you can trust them, that they know their market better than we would, and that they can help to grow those brands. Our China show is now our 3rd largest. They just had 33,000 in March. So that one's growing really crazy. Our Chengdu show that we just launched, we thought we'd have about 3,000 attendees. We had 8,000 attendees. So pretty good return for the first time out on that show. So just a little, again, overview of for this year, we are looking at growing our revenues by about 14%. We also make sure as an industry association that we're reinvesting back into the organization. So our 3-year strategic plan started in 2017. We're investing about $10 million over those 3 years for 5 different strategic initiatives to invest back in the organization. Again, this is just kind of an overview of our growth in our revenue, and again, just to show that about 80% of that is from our trade shows. We do have some conferences that we do with those other global partners, but they're minimal compared to what we do from the trade show perspective. So this is the non-association model where our dues are only 4%. We get, and again, this depends on the year, but between 80 and about 85% is from trade shows, and then the rest is mostly education on our training that we do and the market research reports. Oops, did I lose one? Did I lose a slide? There, that's what I wanted to just jump to. So again, this just also shows the breakdown of our education, that we do have different ways to deliver our education. The other is the online training, but the licensing, contract training, and regional training, again, different ways to deliver the education and build our revenue base. Yes.
The question was, could you expand a little bit on what the education and training is for?
Sure. So the majority of our education and training is technical training. So we have some prep courses. So those are our most popular. So those are our prep courses for our certification. We also do, we just added a design thinking for audiovisual. So there is how to maximize audio systems. So it's mostly technical. We just created a content department that's going to be doing more thought leadership, but for the most part, all of our education is on the technical side. And then, like I said, we have 4 staff instructors, 3 right now, but we're looking for 1 more. Staff instructors that go and do training all over the globe, and then we leverage our volunteers to do a lot of our other training.
Heidi, question about your market research reports. I know a lot of associations actually provide consulting or kind of customized data benchmarking resources. Are your market research reports, do they end there, or do you have companion resources that you sell?
So we do not do additional consulting. We can and will, but have not work with our members to do some custom research if we get there. We just haven't, we're not there yet. That is on the plan. We hired a leader for that function last year, so he's still ramping up. We're still building up our market intelligence function. We switched providers for our big market research report that we do, the industry outlook analysis. We use IHS Market. So that was a big switch for us to really elevate the quality of that. Our senior leader in that group, we've created a dashboard. So it's a little self-service in that, where if you purchase that, you can go in and you can kind of slice and dice the data. But we will be looking to create some either add custom questions to some of the research surveys and or do custom research, but we still are working on our strategic sales to be able to have those conversations with our customers.
I'll just add one other thing really quickly, that whether you're in a professional association or trade association, that question of how are we doing or how am I doing, there are a lot of non-dues revenue ideas around that. And for an individual, it would be, do I have the skills I need to be successful? So whether it's a skills audit and then you link it to all your other products and services, just thinking about companion pieces. So if you have a really successful product, how do you build around that to really drive a deeper level of engagement, and the spend is for something they really need and not something that they feel you're forcing them to participate in.
Yeah, I think the one thing that, at least in our organization, you probably do in yours too, is the debate of should it be free as a member benefit or should we be charging for it? And our C-suite feels very strongly that if there's value, they'll pay for it. And so we've elevated the quality. We've changed to make sure that what we're delivering, and this is specifically around our market research reports, but it's more holistic than that, is that if there's a lot of value, they will pay for it, especially if it's over and above. And we're looking at a big investment. We spend a lot of money on doing that report. So we want, if we're going to be doing it, we want to make sure that there's a value and people actually even want it. If they're not going to pay for it, then we shouldn't even be doing it in the first place. And then again, here just showing my certification, our certification revenue and how that's been growing. So again, a really great revenue stream if folks are looking into that to add to their mix. Any other questions or you want to, yeah.
Heidi, there was a question that came from online. Do you have any sponsorship or advertising revenue, and how does that fit in?
Of course we do. Again, the sponsorship revenue ties into the trade show revenue, so most of that is part of that revenue bucket. We don't do advertising. Well, we do revenue share. Our advertising is done with media partners. So right now we don't have our own publication. Our advertising comes from our show dailies and the actual show guide at the trade shows, and that's just a revenue share with those organizations. We are looking to do a biannual publication starting this year, so we will start to have a little revenue from an advertising stream, but it's nothing that is too strong.
This is great, Heidi. Thank you. What made you decide to get some certifications ANSI approved and others not? What drove that decision?
I'm not sure I know the exact answer to that. Our main certifications, like the ones that a integrator or a designer or architect is going to request in a proposal, those are the ones that are really technical. We want to make sure that people have the skills, and again, that's why we follow the rigorous training program that you put in place. But that's why it's really important, right? Because it's part of a bigger infrastructure. And so, I mean, our hope is that more and more folks are speccing that to make sure that their folks are certified. The other micro-credentials aren't as technical. So like, pulling cable or they're like a really, really niche thing where it's not, our CTS are much more holistic, and you have to understand the whole process, and you need to know audio and visual and microphones and waves and Ohm's law and all this stuff that if you're pulling cable, you probably don't need to know about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for using rigorous. That's what we put in our marketing material. Full disclosure, it's not painful. It is rigorous for a reason. It's because it's the highest.
And that's why we do it.
Right. So it's a market differentiator. Yeah. So I was just curious, being with ANSI, why you decided to do some and not others.
Yeah, I've got our major and the other ones are certificates. Yeah. They're not a whole certification.
Because I think of ASAE, right? So I have my CAE, but it's not ANSI accredited. Correct. And probably, I speculate, there's not a competitor. So maybe ASAE, and I'm not speaking for them, doesn't feel they need to go through that process because they don't need it.
Yeah, I think it probably depends on the industry and the type of certification that you're looking at.
I would just share, we have this conversation often in our association in terms of if we need to do certification. And our competitor is what we call CFRE. I'm in the fundraising, alumni relations, communications, and marketing business. And if you talk to our professionals, they will tell you that that degree doesn't matter, right? And so I remember saying to my boss one time when I was at Yale, I said, hey, I'm going to get my CFRE. And he said, oh, that's awesome. but don't come to me for more money, right? Because it's not going to happen, right? So again, part of that is just how your association perceives that. And so we're on the fence of it, where we've decided actually not to do it.
I think the other thing is, I mean, again, in the tight workforce, that if you have the strict ANSI certified certification, you are much more employable, and you're going to get a much better job than if you don't have it.
Thanks. One thing I wanted to say at the outset that I forgot is at the table, I'd like to say by design, but it's more by happenstance. Vixa is a 501c6 organization, and CASE is 501c3.
Yes. Well, I will just share with you. First of all, I found out today I have the flu, so just stay away. This is
Rob told me after he shook my hand.
I did. But I had sprayed with the vulnerable. So I only have 4 slides. I'm still going to talk 4 hours. But I really, I guess for my part of this, really want to focus a little more on the why. Versus kind of the how, in terms of kind of how do we get there, why are we doing it this way. A little bit about CASE. We were founded in 1974. We really, again, work with alumni relations, fundraising, communications and marketing, and advancement services are the groups that we support. We have a little over 3,600 institutions. Now, for us, our members are institutions, not individuals. We're in about 80 countries around the globe. We have an office here in D.C., one in Singapore, one in Mexico, and one in Latin America. And so we're not as big as you guys are. So we're probably about 110 employees. But we are one of the largest educational associations in the world, and we serve over 91,000 people. The reason I think I'm on this committee is that we are just the opposite, right? So we are that association that does do a lot similar to work you're doing, Heidi, that is actually in it's not in dues. Now, I'm not sure I know. Bam. The other thing I would share with you is really interesting for us as an organization. We are a volunteer-driven organization. So we do over 120 conferences and one-day trainings throughout the world, but 95% of those are done by volunteers. And we do not pay our volunteers. So it's interesting as you kind of talk about that different model. If you look at our revenue, again, from conferences, we bring in about 53% of the revenue. Dues, 34%. 9% is from products and services. And I will say with our conferences, we also include sponsorship and exhibits. Often that's part of that. And then 4% is what I call the other. We this year, about 6 months ago, hired our first vice president for development. So we are going to get into our argument is we're all fundraisers. Why wouldn't we do fundraising? So that's something that we're doing. I thought you said something that was interesting earlier, Shelley. It's this whole idea of how did you get there, right? That it's not this idea. For us, it wasn't let's think about some non-dues revenue, right? But it was really thinking about what are the needs of our members. And so 3 years ago, we launched a pretty intense strategic plan. And through that strategic plan, we found that there were 4 things that were real priorities to our members. 1, globalization. 2, talent management. The 3rd one was thought leadership. And the 4th one was member engagement. And so the big one, and I'll just focus on some of that here in terms of how we created some new products and services, was really in this talent management. In our profession, there just aren't enough fundraisers. Now, we focus on fundraisers because, honestly, we can get alumni relations professionals, we can get communications and marketing, but to really do the fundraising, and if you look at most of the institutions, the universities and four-year institutions and community colleges, almost everyone is in a campaign, right? You're either starting a campaign, you just got out of one, or you're in the quiet or silent phase. And so we're really struggling, and we're doing this what I call, we're taking your candidates and bringing them over to our institution. We'll probably keep them for 2 to 3 years, and then someone else will take them as well. When I came to CASE from the business school, I really came to CASE as the chief diversity officer. And so coming into the organization, one of the things I often say, if there isn't money behind something, I argue often it won't be a priority. And even when I do work with associations that are kind of think about their diversity efforts, one of the questions I always ask is it generating money? Because in many situations, we see that as a net loss to the organization. And so as a turn, we don't I don't think we invest enough on that. But let me go back. I need to go back to this slide. So here's the challenge for me. If you look at, we're bringing 53% of our revenue in from conferences. I have said to my boss, to our president, I think this is really risky, right? And I think we are extremely vulnerable as an organization. Because if we get a downturn in the economy, and guess what? You can't send people to conferences anymore. So that's been the other trigger for me, just as a senior staff person, saying, what is it that we're going to do that's going to help us kind of offset this revenue that's coming from conferences? And we are that kind of, and I hope we're amongst friends and this can stay here, right? So, we're that where we got a $500,000 shortage in the budget. Let's go talk to Rob in conferences. Yeah, you can, so again, how do we help the organization again? But I think that's something that makes us, I argue, pretty vulnerable. Generate $13.5 million in revenue from conferences, and I just talked about this one. So then it was a matter of, so what are the things that we can do that will help us generate new revenue? So a couple of things. So we, believe it or not, we generate almost, at our peak, it was 1.1 million in job postings, which just seems absolutely unheard of. But because of our environment, because people are often in need of trying to find good candidates, that allows us to do that. We've done virtual career fairs. Again, so that generates now. We've just seen that number has dropped in the last couple of years, but that's 900,000. Talent management. Yes.
Could I just point something out about that? Earlier you said when you're talking to the rest of the senior team at your organization, diversification of revenue is somewhat about how to have a diversified portfolio that performs differently depending on the conditions. And what I wrote down was career resources, and whether it's the job board, or I've seen some associations create resume review services that could be done by volunteers or could be done by professionals, kind of a toolkit of career resources. And you might offer that as a member benefit, but if a non-member, let's say the economy, there's really a downturn in the economy, and someone drops membership because employers are no longer paying for it, you still have those resources that are really critical for people in times of economic downturn. So just some other ideas around career that you could really leverage.
We also have an e-mentoring board. I'm mixed on that, if I'm honest with you. I think mentoring doesn't happen in this kind of manufactured way. I think it's really about a relationship that you build with someone, but again, we have it. So yes. So talent management and diversity was where we really did this. We have a student conference that now generates about 400,000. Our student internship program, this was where our members said to us, we need talent. And so we created an internship program now where the students work for 8 weeks at that institution with the intent that hopefully you will hire them. Now we have a training program. Yes, ma'am. Say it one more time, please.
Question was, how do you make money on the internship program?
All money comes to me. That's how no, just kidding. We actually charge, the program is $7,500. We pay the student $5,000, and the members pay CASE $2,500 to participate in the program. And so you can imagine the schools that are usually doing that are what we call, we have what we call our CASE 50, our top 50 fundraising institutions. Many of them are in that program just because of resources. But yeah. And this year we had 106 interns. The residency program kind of came from that because part of our argument was, so now you have 100 interns, where do they go after they graduate? And so now we created this almost 1-year training program. And so in that situation, institution pays CASE $9,500 to participate in that program. And as a result, they again are folded into a lot of our conference and training and development programs. Questions?
Hi, Cindy Paska, the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. You mentioned that you are concerned because so much of your revenue comes from conferences, and it's not just funding, but how have you seen the impact of the growth in technology and the capability of things like we're doing today and, you know, interactive webinar types of training affecting your conference revenue?
Yeah, so we probably 8 years ago really kind of launched a webinar program that was pretty successful. We actually charged our members $200 and $225 to participate in that. About 3 years ago, we went to a new membership model. And so kind of to your point, we just said we're going to stop nickel and diming people. And so now all of our webinars are free. So we had probably 300 institutions that were to participate. Now we have 800 to 900 institutions that are participating, and they can share that with other members. So that was probably how we did that. I don't think we have it right, if I'm honest with you, in terms of the digital space. We're using a company right now called Forum One that we've made an investment in terms of how to look at that digital engagement. Our challenge still, as you kind of talk about what do you put behind the wall and what do you put in front of the wall, you know, I argue if we're trying to do work in Africa or in some of the other countries, and everything is behind the wall, I argue no one's going to purchase that. And so we're really thinking about, as one of our strategic priorities, is this whole idea of digital engagement and a digital membership campaign in terms of what would that look like. And my argument is everything can't. You know more about this than I do, but my argument is that everything can't be behind the wall, especially if you're trying to recruit new members. And then the other challenge we have with our conferences and with our dues, you know, in some of the smaller countries, you know, I have one choice, right? So I can either pay the dues and pay those fees, or I can go to your conference. In most cases, we can't do both. And so we're really now trying to think about what does that model look like? You know, is there a way to bundle that? Is there a way to kind of package that? You buy the membership and you get this one signature conference as part of that.
Yeah, employer support is so important. I think unraveling that question, are people receiving that support? Because, so if you take government agencies and federal government, it's very rare for an agency to support membership, but they'll pay for registration fees. Or it might be even the case in academia where you have to pay out of your budget. And so how you work around that, and again, thinking about the realities, you're not going to have an impact in changing what that employer support looks like, but could you create a bundle or another offering that works around the barriers that your members or your prospects have?
Okay. Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks. So obviously, a lot of these innovative ideas and different approaches to generating revenue can implicate some tax and legal points that we want to make sure we cover. And you know, there's a lot of room and you know, opportunity for growing revenue for an association that won't be prohibited. But sometimes you may want to make the choice that, you know what, maybe we'll pay a little tax on this revenue, or maybe, you know, this is something that's worth doing in a related for-profit subsidiary or something like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these tax issues, you know, the big picture points on it, and then some of the other legal issues that come into play, and then hopefully have a little bit more time for closing questions. And when we talk about unrelated business income tax, which is sort of the affectionately known as UBIT acronym that affects so many nonprofit organizations, it's interesting to note that while there's so many different sections of the code that apply to different types of tax-exempt organizations, by and large, the people in the room and the people on the phone, these UBIT principles sort of cut across, you know, C3, 4, and 6. But one point that you do need to remember is your section of the code and your mission and what your articles of incorporation, your bylaws say is what you're limited to doing, will sort of define what is a related activity. And when we talk about you know, the different types of organizations, just, you know, think big picture. A 501c3 organization has an obligation to operate for the benefit of the public. It's a publicly beneficial mission that you have to have and you have to pursue. By contrast, a 501c6 organization is operating for the benefit of an industry or a profession. So a slightly more narrow focal point. But when we talk about some of the issues as to whether it's related to your exempt purpose or not, remember that public benefit versus industry or profession benefit. And when we talk about some of these activities, we'll get into some of the exceptions. I know there are a lot of questions around, okay, we've got a trade show here that's partnering with a for-profit. What about that? Advertising, you talked about, what's meant by sponsorship, career fair revenue. There are all sorts of sort of UBIT implications to a lot of these that I'll talk about briefly. But at a big picture level, sort of the elements of unrelated business income. If you are a tax-exempt organization, the general concept is you don't pay tax on your net income. You get revenue in, and the beauty of being tax-exempt is you don't pay taxes. But if you're engaged in an activity that's a trade or business that's regularly carried on and that's not related to your exempt purpose, you could very well be in the position of having to pay unrelated business income tax on the revenue that comes in from that activity. There are a lot of exceptions and a lot of exclusions to that. But the idea here is that, at some point, and we've talked internally in our trainings about the Mueller spaghetti company and the New York University and sort of the quintessential or the case, I guess, that brought about the enactment of the unrelated business income tax, which as a tax-exempt organization, you can't be out there doing things that are unrelated to your mission and sort of competing on a sort of favorable basis by virtue of not having to pay tax against the for-profit tax-paying world. So the notion here is that, look, we've got an activity that's not related to our exempt purpose. We really should be paying tax just like others do. It's obviously you're able to deduct your related expenses. Now, there's a new tax law that's been enacted that many of you may have heard of that sort of changes how you can actually make those deductions for your expenses. And without going into too much detail, for purposes of this discussion, no longer can you sort of bundle all of your unrelated income and then expense all of your unrelated expenses against that income. You have to do it sort of activity by activity. So if you have an unrelated advertising activity and some unrelated merchandise sales activities, to pay UBIT now, you have to sort of properly count your expenses as to each of those activities. And if you made money on one, you're paying tax on that one. I guess the good news, that's sort of the bad news for associations that are engaged in unrelated activities. The good news is the rate you're paying now has gone down substantially. You're not paying 35%, you're paying 21% on your net income. So, as I said, the rules on UBIT generally apply across the board. You have to look to what your purposes as an organization are, obviously, to see if it's related or not. And I should say, going back to the elements, when we talk about a trade or business, virtually any activity where you're generating money is going to sort of qualify for that element. Regularly carried on, there's case law that says an annual activity is not regularly carried on, but the IRS will look to those types of activities and look to what you do in between each year to prepare for that activity, and has found subsequent to that case decision that you could have an annual activity that is viewed as regularly carried on. So very, sort of fact-dependent calculation. Where most of the arguments happen and most of the case law and the rulings that we get from the IRS come is on this last element, is it substantially related to your exempt purposes? So let's think very broadly. We already got a few questions online on this. What are some of the sort of general types of activities that we engage in as associations, and what's sort of the general position of the IRS or the courts on those activities? So if you're holding a webinar or an educational event, again, assuming it's educational, sort of related to your exempt mission, almost always that's viewed as related to your exempt purposes, regardless if it's regularly carried on or not, usually not taxable. Advertising income, and just think, for purposes of this, think of the magazine, an ad in the magazine. If you're selling ads in your magazine, you almost certainly should be paying taxes on the income that's derived from the sales of that advertising income. Dues income, usually not taxable. I say usually because some associations and other groups in years past have sought to create different categories of membership that really have no participatory rights with the association, but maybe you get access to insurance programs, or maybe you get access to some unrelated benefit. Just calling it dues isn't enough, obviously. If you're engaged in activity that's basically selling a product or service that's unrelated to your exempt mission, then you're probably going to have to pay tax there. But the general rule, of course, is dues is not taxable. Sale of products on your website that's not related to your mission, usually taxable. And one thing that we're not sort of, not on the agenda for today, but not only usually taxable at the federal level, but also there's sales tax implications for that activity. Job posting revenue, the IRS has come to say that the revenue that comes from that activity, its position is that that's usually taxable, and they liken it to advertising. I'll figure it out one of these. So there are some exclusions. So even though you might have some activities that sound suspect, maybe you feel you meet all those three elements, if you are engaged in activity that's put on, substantially all of the time and effort is put on by volunteers, think of a bake sale at a church or a charity, that sort of activity, the revenue generated from that doesn't have to be subject to UBIT. There's sort of this convenience of members, staff, and students. In the case of colleges and universities, it's sort of the college bookstore exception. You engage in activity that might otherwise be viewed as unrelated because it's connected with an overall related activity, and it's truly for the convenience of members, or in the case of bookstores, students, you can get out from under UBIT as well. And then thrift store, the sale of donated items, generally is viewed as exempt from unrelated business income tax. The ones that I'll talk more about are sort of in the second category of exceptions and modifications. Many of you have good reserve funds and you do good jobs with it in investing it. Obviously, the interest, the dividends, capital gains, and those sorts of things that come out of that, all not taxable. Qualified convention and trade show income, I'll talk more about that, and sort of the great stuff that Heidi was talking about. Generally, you fit under that exception for qualified convention and trade show income, and we'll talk a little bit about what the IRS has said when you have a joint venture or an activity with even a for-profit corporation, and whether that exception can still apply. Corporate sponsorship, obviously, that's a key non-dues revenue source for a lot of our associations. I'll talk a little bit more in detail as to what how to categorize your revenue properly as corporate sponsorship, and therefore accepted from UBIT. Royalties, generally license of your name, your intellectual property, usually in an affinity context. You're doing an affinity program with a member benefit program. Again, you have an exception there, which we'll talk about very briefly. And then won't talk about anymore other than to say rents from your property. If you have a wholly owned office building, for instance, and you have space and you rent it out, if you don't have debt on that property, the rent you receive generally is not subject to UBIT. So, so we'll start with convention and trade shows. So they're written into the tax code many years ago. Section 513D provides an exception to unrelated business income tax for qualified convention and trade show income. Now, I would argue that most conventions and trade shows, particularly for 501c6 organizations that are in the business of promoting their industry or their profession, would be viewed as a related activity of the organization. But you don't have to get to that argument because you have a built-in exception in the tax code for that. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on how aggressive you want to be, there's not much by way of objective definition as to what counts as a qualified convention and trade show. And this was enacted in the 1970s, so things like all of the sorts of bells and whistles that go with a trade show, if you were ever to walk the floor of an Infocom, for instance, weren't even a gleam in anyone's eye in the 1970s. So you've got this rather broad definition saying, okay, well, a qualified convention and trade show includes activity that is of a kind traditionally conducted at conventions, annual meetings, or trade shows. So not a lot to go on with that. What we do have, though, is the IRS over the course of many years has issued private letter rulings, technical advice memos, these sort of individualized rulings as to specific taxpayers to say, we've reviewed these facts and here's what we think with regard to the convention and trade show exception. So one thing that's important to note, sort of to get to the point of Vixa's good work and some of the activities it's engaging in overseas and with partners, the fact that you're partnering with another entity, even a non-exempt entity, for the conduct of the show is not going to be determinative from the IRS's perspective as to whether you're generating unrelated business income from that show. Whether they look to the activity itself. Is the underlying activity a qualified convention and trade show? Are you there to promote the products and services of your industry? And so with those relationships carefully crafted and make sure that your contracts with and agreements with these other providers are done in a way that protects the organization and protects the character and nature of the program, you can still get qualified convention and trade show revenue, not have to worry about paying unrelated business income tax, even though you may have a partner or other beneficiary of the trade show that's not exempt. So we've got a good private letter ruling to point us in that direction. I should say, sort of a lawyerly disclaimer here, the way the IRS does these private letter rulings, it makes very clear this applies to one organization and one organization only. You're not really supposed to cite it as precedent. But the IRS has not been doing much by way of precedential guidance over the years, so this is all we've got. It's at least reassuring to know they're thinking on it. One point that's interesting that comes up from time to time and may be surprising to you, and no need to raise your hands, but a lot of organizations will have trade show directories, exhibit directories, and things like that, and will sell advertising in connection with those directories. There has been a ruling that the IRS has come out with to say, sure, it's part and parcel of the qualified convention and trade show, but you're exploiting that exempt activity, or in this case it's really an excluded activity, but you're exploiting that exempt activity for purposes of doing a non-exempt thing, selling ads. And as I said before, selling ads in the eyes of the IRS, you almost can never get out of paying taxes on that. So you may have a tax obligation for the advertising revenue from those programs. Switch over to the sponsorship and some of the tax issues that come up with that real quickly. I like to sort of give a little bit of framework for qualified corporate sponsorship. In the 1980s, those of you who are college football fans who may be old enough to remember, in the 1980s, bowl games actually didn't have sponsor names to them. So there was just the Cotton Bowl, it was just the Sugar Bowl, it was just the Orange Bowl. And then someone got wise. Well, first I should explain something that I still haven't quite understood, but apparently the organizers that are sort of the corporate entities behind these bowl games are themselves tax-exempt organizations. I'm not sure how they made it to that, but they are. Someone got wise and thought, well, we can sell these naming rights and these sponsorship rights to these games. So then you have the Mobile Cotton Bowl and the Tostitos Fiesta Bowl, whatever. The IRS started to get aggressive on that and say, well, this appears to be a advertising opportunity, not really anything that we should think twice on taxing. Well, some Southern senators got wind of what was going on with the IRS, and lo and behold, the tax code was amended in the 1990s to include a specific exception for sponsorship revenue. And so we have them to thank for a great sort of exception to UBIT that's crafted in a way I think is very favorable to the exempt organization community. The notion here is that you can receive qualified sponsorship revenue, a payment in the form of a sponsorship, and offer certain benefits back to the sponsor, which they call mere use or acknowledgement under the statute and the regs, and still not have to pay tax on that sponsorship payment. And that mere use or acknowledgement includes the listing of a name, logo, listing of product lines of the sponsor, a listing of the address, the phone number, all of those things that I've listed there. And all of that is okay for you to take that money and have it subject to the exception under the corporate sponsorship rule. Where you could get into trouble and have to pay tax is if you do more than just merely acknowledge your sponsor. And by the way, there's no sort of limit in the size. I mean, if we had a sponsor for this program, it could be across as high as the ceiling with a, we thank our sponsor, listing the name, the logo, and all those good things that are under the use or acknowledgement category. Where organizations can risk the non-UBIT treatment of sponsorship revenue is if they engage in some sort of qualitative promotion of the sponsor or otherwise give sort of advertising benefits to the sponsor, even so much as to say, we exhort, we ask you to go patronize the sponsor, go buy this product, go buy this service. Then we've moved from mere use or acknowledgement into advertising. Where this happens in the real world with most of the associations we work with is, well, we want to sponsor your program, your event, your activity, and we want the banners, we want our name and logo everywhere, all fine. We also want an ad in your magazine. We also want a banner ad on your website. Those sorts of other benefits are what jeopardize the tax treatment of the full sponsorship payment. Now, I say the full sponsorship payment because you can actually split the revenue between qualified sponsorship and advertising or taxable income. You have to do it based on the fair market value of the sort of the substantial return benefit that comes back. So the advertising, whatever it is, if you've got a rack rate for a quarter page ad in your magazine and that's one of the sponsor benefits, well, pay tax on that. And the remaining amount of sponsorship you can still treat as not taxable. So that's where I say it's sort of a favorable to exempt organizations provision. So I'll quickly hit royalty. I want to leave some time for questions here. Think of it in the terms of the Affinity credit card, the Affinity member benefit program, the Hertz rental car program, those sorts of things. Many of you who have been around the world for a while have probably sort of seen the battles that have happened on this issue from a tax perspective at the court level. The IRS ultimately lost on its position generally. But the idea here is, we have people out here, many of our associations, you have associate members, you have businesses that want to have access to your members through an affiliation, an affinity with your organization. They want to sort of benefit from the halo that your organization brings. So what they ask for is, hey, can we use your name and logo and brand our product or service in a way that incorporates your name or logo? And in exchange for you letting us do that, we'll pay you a cut of every sale that happens under that program. If that's all that happens, and it's a passive license of your name and logo to the credit card company or whatever it might be, you are receiving, in the eyes of the courts and now in the eyes of the IRS, you're receiving tax-free royalty revenue for that. It's an exception under the rule. Of course, those conversations never go that way, because those conversations usually are, sure, we want to use your name, your logo, and be able to market to your members, but we want your help in marketing, because you guys are the ones who your members will listen to. So we want you to engage in activity or services that will help promote the program. And when you have that active activity from the association, you could jeopardize the tax treatment of the revenue. Instead of being royalty, the IRS would say it's UBIT. You're not in the business of just licensing your name and logo and maybe exercising some control over that use of that logo. You are actually in the business of selling credit cards. You're actually in the business of selling rental cars. And so what we normally advise in that situation is, look, if the for-profit provider is a lucrative opportunity for you, and this is what must happen in order for the deal to be consummated, consider bifurcating the deal so that you can actually get paid a portion of the revenue in the form of a royalty based on your license of your name and logo, and another portion based on the marketing activity that you undertake. It's always difficult to calculate how to do that split, and we often get that question. It's more an art than a science, I would say. Ideally, you would maybe make a little money on the royalty on the marketing side, so you're paying a little bit of tax. If you're taking huge losses on the marketing and doing great on the royalty, that's going to raise eyebrows with the IRS. Looks like we have a question here.
Hello, it's on. Hi, George, and hi, Shelley. Related to this issue of being careful about avoiding UBIT issues, can you speak to what you see happening with organizations that are saying, yes, we realize that we may be facing UBIT issues, but that's fine. We're going to go ahead and set up a for-profit subsidiary?
Sure. Even before this new tax law, there's some attraction to forming a for-profit subsidiary because you're never feeling constrained about where your next activity might go. It's a more of an entrepreneurial mindset, and you still have the benefit of being connected with the association. Having said that, many of the for-profit subsidiaries that I'm aware of that I work with aren't quite churning out huge profits yet. From a legal perspective, a tax perspective, we normally suggest somewhere around, if you're looking at 25% of your overall revenue starting to come in the form of unrelated business income, probably a good idea to start putting some of those things in a for-profit sub. It's become more attractive to do a for-profit subsidiary now under a tax planning perspective because of that bundling issue I talked about at the beginning on taxes. You actually have a better tax treatment for your activities in the for-profit sub than you do even when you're paying UBIT at the association level. So yeah, the last thing I would say on the royalty deal is, we can help, your lawyers can always help you craft a great royalty agreement that shows pure passivity. There's just licensing the name and logo. We're not, going to do anything else. But if the reality is pretty obvious that you're actually out there actively promoting it, I mean, an IRS or a court will look beyond the contract. It's great to start with a good contract, but live up to what you say in the contract as well. So lastly, just some other sort of non-tax legal issues to consider with some of the things we talked about today. Not on the list, but, Heidi talked a lot about international activities. Obviously, any sort of major activity you're undertaking in a different jurisdiction is going to implicate that jurisdiction's laws with regard to, doing business, employment issues. That's why I think, probably one of the most compelling reasons for always partnering when you're going overseas is you can have a local body on the ground, a local entity that knows those laws and can be sort of the employer of record, for instance. And there's, some of the jurisdictions are subject to restrictions under U.S. law, sanctions and the like. So be aware of those sorts of things when you're engaging internationally and overseas. When I talk about some of the affinity programs, we talked very briefly about insurance, like an insurance member benefit program. Be aware that if you're collecting a portion of the insurance broker fees from a program like that, there are state laws that are very specific as to sharing of commissions for insurance, and some can be very restrictive. I would say in terms of enforcement, we've not seen much on the association side, but it's kind of a sleeping giant. I think at some point, commissioners in these various states may see that a lot of associations are collecting a portion of broker fees, which may be in their eyes contrary to the state statute that restricts that and says you must be a licensed broker only to collect those fees. Similarly, on the healthcare side, if you're dealing with a healthcare organization and you have a member benefit program that you'd like to offer that involves products or services that are subject to reimbursement under Medicare or Medicaid, stop. Call your lawyer and make sure that you talk about whether that implicates the anti-kickback statutes, because that's a very severe problem if you go forward without that compliance. And then generally, when we talk about sponsorship, we talk about accreditation, certification, but mostly maybe in the sponsorship and the royalty realm. And if we're lending our name and logo and our halo to this third-party company, from a legal perspective, are we affiliating ourselves with a company that we may not know the quality of their products or services? We may not know how well they do out there in the field. And obviously, from a legal perspective, you could, if someone's caused harm, if harm is caused to someone and they show some reliance on our endorsement and our connection with the provider, we may have invited more trouble than we needed on the legal side. I think more realistically and more common is the reputational risk that goes along with that. And we were talking a while ago about, again, showing my age a little bit, but American Medical Association and Sunbeam back in the 90s, and that was sort of a good example of, perhaps a non-dues revenue program that maybe got off too quickly without thinking about some of those reputational risks. And finally, antitrust is always a legal issue to consider in the trade association and nonprofit world. Be careful with exclusive sponsorships and types of arrangements that exclude other competitors, competing organizations from access to things like your trade show or advertising and things like that. The general rule is that exclusion has to cause competitive harm for it to be a real risk, but that can happen sometimes in these niche trade associations and industries where you really provide the best vehicle for a company to market to your members, for example. Creating an exclusive sponsorship relationship where you're shutting out other companies from being able to market themselves effectively could give rise to antitrust risk on that front. I think I'd written one more down. No, it was ANSI accreditation. So I was just going to say we have someone in the room. So certification activities, obviously, you can add to sort of the quality and the reputation of your certification program by getting accredited by a body like ANSI. But just be aware that there are some requirements that go along with that, and they would be happy to inform you what they are. But sometimes it has to do with how closely you can be connected to the membership side of decision making as opposed to the certification side of decision making. And you may, sometimes organizations, because of that, may set up either related entities or just create a good firewall between the general membership discussion and the certification discussion, but it's something to always be aware of on the certification side as well. With that, I think I've left a few minutes for any further questions that you guys might have. So we sort of served dessert first here. We had the interesting peers talk to you, and then we hit you with the vegetables at the end. One point that I wanted to add, particularly, and Shelley brought it up, on the 501c6 side of the equation. When you start talking about customization of products and services for particular members, such as consulting for a company member who pays you to do that, that can actually create some concern under the tax code for what the IRS says is particular services, the provision of particular services for members under 501c6. The IRS would say that activity may be something that generates taxable income. So, and then a question that came online was you know, we're talking about UBIT, and we're also talking about qualifications to serve as a tax-exempt organization by following your mission. I think I sort of in a circuitous way got around to the fact that it's okay to have a certain amount of your activity that generates unrelated business income, therefore have a certain amount of unrelated activity. But if you have too much, you do run the risk of losing your tax-exempt status because you're no longer doing the business of your mission, you're doing the business of your unrelated activity. Okay, this one goes to maybe to Heidi or Rob, or any of you. From a buy-in perspective, for the need to evolve and make changes and set the organization on the path of sustainability, do you have thoughts on inclusiveness with organization as well as board of directors involvement? Any challenges with regard to intergenerational perspective, particularly the use of Internet of Things tools such as social media and apps? So very big picture there, but a question really having to do with you know, getting an organizational culture of inclusiveness, both sort of at the member level and the board level. So maybe, Rob, given your past experience, might be something.
Well, I guess for us, it goes back to the work that we did with the strategic plan. We did a very large listening tour, and there were many communities that we engaged in that conversation. For us, before we could approve the strategic plan, the board had to sign off on that. And so for us, it's been endorsed by the board. And, you know, in terms of being inclusive, I think we are more with probably our leadership, but we also did a lot of work with entry-level professionals because we also wanted them to buy into this, because I think it's easy to kind of put something in front of a senior leader and say, does this make sense? But if you're an entry-level professional, does this really matter to you?
I know that ASAE within the staff has approached you know, kind of greater inclusion because there was a subset of the staff that came forward and said, we feel like we can add a lot to the conversation and we're not able to do that today. So ASAE, I know in its usual fishbowl perspective is doing a lot of work in this area. And I would say from, you know, diversification of revenue, those are young professionals. That tends to be an audience that doesn't have a lot of resources, but the lifetime value of a young member is really high, and they tend to have very critical needs. They're very low on the hierarchy of needs. They need help validating their skill set. They need help finding a job. Maybe they need help with loan forgiveness or navigating a loan. So, you know, being able to turn internally to a particular audience because they have a perspective on maybe a new market or an existing market that you could really expand resources to fill a need and, as a byproduct, diversify the revenue of the organization.
And I would say for us, we are very lucky that our board really isn't involved in any of our operations. They really are a strategic governing entity. So we work, the senior leadership team and the board work together to create our strategy. It's a 3-year strategy. We're now looking at revising that, looking at it every year for 3 years and then starting from scratch. Really then, as soon as we have that high-level strategy, it goes to our staff to completely be responsible for the implementation of that. And one of the things that we are doing internally is really trying to change the culture of our organization to push a lot of the decision-making down to our distributed leaders and not have our senior leadership making all of the decisions. And I think that helps to bring out that creativity of different levels of folks within the organization, give them the opportunity to be more innovative, or as my colleague from England says, innovative. I know I always stop to think of how am I supposed to say that now? But really, as far as looking at engaging different audiences and how we're going to actually make that strategic plan come to life, it's really about trying to push all of that decision-making down through the organization, so it's not just some of us, older folks sitting there pretending like we have all the answers and making all the decisions. It's really empowering the other folks that know what's going on with Internet of Things and going on with the new technology and leveraging that to make sure that we're implementing as we're charged to do.
I had a question maybe for Shelley. How often do you see associations setting up consulting practices within their association, and what are the kind of benefits and pitfalls of that, if you've seen them?
Yeah, it's similar to accreditation, where it takes some work to set it up. So I would say making sure that the need is really there. And there's often a need, but really understanding exactly what that need is. It usually happens for, obviously, trade associations. And I don't have percentages, but I think there's a lot of potential around it, but making sure that the program's built in the right way and that it's managed the right way. Because just like for my firm, for example, if one of my colleagues is working with a client, that experience could be different than the experiences with me. So every one individual who is a consultant represents your reputation, and you have to be sure that that reputation is to the level that you need, and you're really monitoring satisfaction and outcome of the engagement.
Can I add to that? One of the challenges that we had when we were thinking about consultants is we have a very large, what we call educational partners. And so if we think about consulting, I argue we're probably stepping on their toes. So again, just understanding what the impact of that relationship, if you do choose to go that way.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is sort of getting into that issue of, whether or not you're going to consult or perhaps recommend consultants. We typically only recommend members, but we're starting to find that there may be some need to have a directory of others. And I don't know if anyone's had any experience with that. And then the second question I have is, it feels like, at least for my son, YouTube is the way to get all information. And that's a huge, these are really well-produced educational videos that make the stuff associations do look totally lame and not something that a younger audience is going to want to even pay attention to. Have you heard of any associations that have really been able to utilize the YouTube space, and then what sort of tax ramifications do they have for that?
I think we have a YouTube channel, don't we, Camille? On the tax side, I don't know that it would be the same analysis. It's an activity like any other. I'm not sure where the revenue comes from on that. I guess through sponsored ads, yeah, and you would have the same, very likely taxable under the advertising rules.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm kind of stumped, so I would say probably not a lot of associations have that. But I do think that using YouTube, it's thinking about what do you want to accomplish with different channels, just like the traditional marketing approach. And so to me, YouTube is not about suddenly introducing something and asking someone to pay for it, because that would be a classic trip up of, coming into space where you get a lot of information for free. But could you pair YouTube with another resource you have? So it's kind of a complement to certification or something like that, paid resources and free resources. Or can you use it to promote a resource that you're offering for a fee?
I will say there are a couple of trade associations that I do work with that have really popular videos that are sort of in the how-to realm. One's in a building industry, so it's metal building group, how to build a metal building, and people love it. Of course, they're not monetizing it; they're building their recognition, and but it is. I do know of a few of those. It's that sort of. It's like, whenever our kids, they never look for a user manual. They just go right on YouTube, how to put this thing together.
I think what YouTube is really good at, so did you want to add something, is, you have the ability to pause. Like my nephew learned how to play the banjo, and he just plays it again and again and again. So you get this mentoring, teaching that you wouldn't normally have in a quick lesson. And so some of that, I think, too, is thinking broadly about education, and a theme that I see a lot of and recommend a lot, too, whether it's a trade show or conference or a training, is really creating case studies. Members tend to love that, especially if you take like the healthcare field. I know a couple of healthcare associations that have sessions where it's real time, like solve this challenge. What would you do with a patient if XYZ happened? And those tend to be very popular, and I think they're really easily translatable into some kind of training or online offering.
And I'll just answer maybe the first part of that question. So what we did was, because we weren't necessarily comfortable with creating kind of the consultancy or that part of the business, we actually created a program which was called the peer review program. So we would have a group of volunteers that if you say, I need someone to come look at my program, they would come spend 3 days, do a write-up, but again, not consultant. But then what we would do is we would then hand that report to one of the consulting firms.
George, this is a comment probably that you can answer, but going back to the DOL final rule on association health plans, you hit on affinity plans a little bit. Just wanted to hear a little bit more of your thoughts in terms of associations collecting revenues on behalf of insurance products, because really what the rule does is it allows, as you know, employers to sell more group insurance to their membership base as opposed to on an individual chassis. And so it's no longer an environment where it's just providing homeowners and auto insurance to your membership base. Now it's opening up new avenues that are frankly unpioneered so far, meaning medical, dental, life, disability, voluntary products, all those things. So what are your thoughts there? And maybe it's an environment where it's just a benefit to your member to drive revenues rather than collecting commissions on behalf of the insurance products.
We've, as you might imagine, I don't know if I'm on or not. We've received a lot of inquiries this year as DOL loosened the rules. And there are a lot of trade associations sort of testing the waters, and not at all is sort of to suggest that it's not a real good opportunity. There are some state level restrictions that are still in place that is yet to be determined as to how some of those restrictions will sort of play into the overall sort of ease of doing that. It's definitely easier than it ever has been, but still associations are sort of making their way through those state-based issues. I would say the ones that I've talked to so far about it are far more in the camp of, we've got a lot of small employer members who would benefit greatly from this. This is a great member benefit. We're not looking to necessarily sort of ring the cash registers too much on this, although maybe if that comes later, then great. But the ones that I'm talking to, again, it's sort of an anecdotal sample, are more of the lines like, boy, the members would just eat this up if we could do it. But I feel like, and we've done a couple of alerts on that, by the way, and happy to share them with you on particularly that state issue that seems to be a bit of a drag on the excitement, but not totally throwing cold water on it. Okay, maybe one more.
Thank you. So this question is directed more towards Shelley, but in terms of research and associations providing research and potential, data products, is there a certain profile of the research or the data output that lends it more towards being sold as non-dues revenue rather than being passed through and bundled in with the dues revenue?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I've seen associations struggle with that. there's a certain set of industry research that for PR purposes, so the media, legislators are really curious about growth of the industry sector or whatever it might be. So it's that good of the order product. But then when you look at benchmarking data, that's something that it's very compelling for CEOs. They really don't know how they're doing compared to others. And when you think about the niche that an association can serve that very few other organizations can serve. Of course, a for-profit provider could pop up and gather that, but an association is a really trusted source, so it's a natural extension then to build a product like benchmarking data that is very sellable. Usually expensive to build to, but typically members will pay for it.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists, and I thought it was a great program. Appreciate it.